Well, beautiful. We're going to go ahead and get started. I love the connections that are here and how everyone has interacted with each other in different spaces. Ra, if you could go ahead and share.
Yes, I will do that. Just give me a second.
Thank you. And the guests that are joining, if you want to add in the chat where you're calling in from, it's always good to see the collaboration that is here.
Okay, yeah, then I think, Kayla, you're going to start, right?
Absolutely.
Let me know when you want to move the slide deck.
Okay, beautiful. You can, yeah, perfect. All right, thank you guys. And so Rua and I are here with Maravilla, and we're gonna quickly introduce you to who we are, and then introduce the topic. And then we're really excited for our panelists to introduce themselves as well. We have a lot of diverse background here and a lot of really beautiful experience. So really quickly, Manavia, our hope and our focus is to reconnect relationships between land and people on the front lines of climate change, which the front lines in our current world conditions are growing. The places where the extremes are happening, there's just more and more of that. And so we're excited to be with all these people here who have a lot of experience in those spaces. And so some of our focuses are education, design, and then sustainable consultation. And all of this, our goal is to do it alongside communities and to bring up voices who are already working in these spaces. Beautiful. Thank you, Ra.
Okay, good. Yeah, then let me take over. As Kayla mentioned, we are just going to introduce the topic of today, and this is not going to be a lecture. This is going to be very short. We are just laying the scene and yeah, just introducing the topic. So yeah, climate change impacts. I think a couple of years ago, that was still something that was discussed as something that will happen in the future or might happen in the future. But the future has arrived and it's happening right now. It has already actually happened for a couple of years, but it might have not always been so apparent. But it becomes more and more apparent as the climate change impacts are happening more frequently and also happening quite, drastically as well. When we talk about climate change impacts, I think the first thought that everyone has is related to natural events, natural disasters. And this is the one which is, I think, also the one that people experience as the most direct impact of climate change. We have put in here a few headlines of events which only happened this year, but you can find many, many more for this year. You can also find many, many more if you look at the previous years as well. And you can see we have the impacts, the natural events, the catastrophes show their faces in different ways. We have heat waves, for example, in May, I think April, May, in Pakistan and India, which were really, really severe and which also led to a lot of heat-related deaths. Then just a couple of weeks or months ago, if my memory is not mistaken me, we had also very heavy rainfall in Central Europe, and that led to flooding, which is also happening now more frequently in Europe. And you can see here the damage being happening to infrastructure, to buildings, but also causing loss of human lives. And another example here, wildfires in California. Warren just mentioned that a few minutes ago, which also happens more frequently and also doesn't only happen in California, but in many other countries. And these are just examples. There are many more. There are droughts, there are sandstorms. There are many different phases of climate change impacts in the natural space as natural events. But there are also other impacts of climate change, which might be not so apparent for many, but which are equally important. And these are, for example, we are just looking at social impacts right now. And if we look at that locally, that translates very often in heat-related illnesses and deaths. That's the one thing. Another part, which I also mentioned, is the impact on infrastructure, impact on buildings, impact on streets, bridges, and so on. And both this impacts on human health and impacts on infrastructure and buildings will sooner or later also translate into economic loss. It will have an impact on the local economy, on businesses, and this will be then also seen as economic instability and also loss. Another part is the agricultural part or the land part. Climate change is one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why arable land is lost. And in most cases, this also translates into reduced crop yields. So these local impacts, since we are living in a globalized world, this will usually not stay local, but it will spread or will have a global impact as well. And this will be seen usually in most cases as in food insecurity and famine in other parts of the world. It also leads to poverty and crisis, and sooner or later, both of these will lead into displacement and migration of people. So these impacts as well are not experienced by everyone equally. And I'm just going to hand over to Kayla for the next slide. Oh, sorry.
It's so good. So I think we have seen just from the global news that, as Rina pointed out, while these things are increasing and they are happening everywhere, no one is exempt. The communities that are most impacted are in spaces who also have less access to the resources to respond, or because of previous conflict, are now in a space where they're responding to recovery from conflict and then also dealing with climate change. And sometimes those are integrated with each other, and often they're integrated with each other. But what's beautiful about this call is our panelists have worked in a lot of these countries or are living in some of them. And so I'm excited for them to go ahead and introduce themselves. And we'll actually, so we see Afghanistan on this list. Rina, could you go ahead and get us started introducing yourself for 1 to 2 minutes? Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Good morning, evening, everybody. My name is Rina. I've been an aid worker in Afghanistan for 7 of the last 10 years, and I was an environmental advisor and worked in agriculture before that. I currently work for a German-based NGO called Welthungerhilfe, which, yes, I did have to practice saying when I joined it, which means World Hunger Help. And I've been heading up all their programming in Afghanistan for the last 2.5 years since the Taliban takeover. But recently I was able to negotiate a most excellent demotion. I worked hard for it. And I am now the NRM Agriculture and Environmental Technical Advisor, which fits perfectly with my background in land management, in farming, and my passion for permaculture. Now, I'm aware that I'm deep in the broken and flawed aid industry, but it does remain one of the very few ways that you can get into countries like Afghanistan that really have collapsed in many ways. And I also see a lot of opportunities in the cracks. The needs are really high, and the spaces in between is really where everything happens in countries like Afghanistan. So I feel very honored to be on the panel today. I don't feel like I've made very much progress in the world of regenerative ag or permaculture in Afghanistan, but I am now finally well positioned and in the early stages of my mission to green the country. And I'm looking forward to tonight's conversations and questions and networking to learn from others. Thank you.
Thank you, Rina. And if we can go ahead, and right next door, Galawezh is in Kurdistan. Galawezh, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Galawezh Bayiz. I'm also an aid worker since '92. Currently based in Erbil. So I'm also a founder of an NGO based in the Kurdistan region of Iraq called Eco Vital. thank you very much for this invitation, Kayla and Roa, and I look forward to learning from others as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Galawezh. Thanks. Rosemary, can we go over to you? Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you very much. It was wonderful to be invited to be on this panel, and you have so much experience and knowledge, probably much more than I have of the big NGOs. So I started work in post-war areas such as Vietnam and Cambodia. For that, I started as a development worker. So that was in Lesotho in Africa, and then moved on from there. Spent some years there and found I didn't have anything to offer. I was an agricultural scientist who knew about sheep and wheat. It was hopeless. And that again sets in question the development work that you do. And then in Vietnam and Cambodia, I found that with permaculture, we had a very good presentation, and we had a good scheme that led a way into any culture. So that by handing it over to the local people, not working with the big NGOs, well, I did from time to time in country, but that's a different thing from being employed by them. So that I worked with the Department of Women's Affairs, or I worked with the Department of the Environment. I didn't work with the big NGOs except occasionally to earn a few dollars to do a survey or an evaluation for them. Out of that came a whole modification of the permaculture curriculum, as I saw it and experienced it. And more recently, with working into refugee camps, it's been modifying it again in big cities, because we could have this talk. I think permaculture has no relevance unless it applies to big cities and crowded spaces. And I think that's the future, whether it's 70% of people in cities or whether it's people in, unfortunately, camps and settlements. But unless permaculture can deliver well with good teaching and learning strategies that are utterly relevant, then I think we can all go home and go to bed. Well, Warren can, because it's getting later for him, but for the rest of you. So I guess my commitment is to teach where it counts, to teach where people can't get this information normally. Because in most of these communities, they can't get it, they can't access it. They're caught by poverty or occupation, as in the case of Srinagar, war, whatever it is. So then who is going to offer something of value, relevant information that can really, really affect people's lives and which everyone can access? It's not esoteric. You don't have to run around with a big microscope and all sorts of equipment. It's a head thing that people can translate to their own circumstance. So I think the teaching and the curriculum examples and strategies had to be changed. They haven't changed very much about the importance of soil and water and biodiversity and forests and those. It's been more developing something that is global and fits the real world rather than the artificial world, which I think is pretty much the Western world. Everyone's got a backyard or going to the country of 3-5 acres to make their dream farm. It's not the real world. It's not the majority world. So that's me anyway. And totally worthwhile. And I want to say I'm on Gundungurra land, never ceded. Aboriginal tribe who live here have never, ever ceded sovereignty to this land for a moment. And it also was never degraded under their care, which was supposed to be, I think, 40,000 years. So we do have models of setting up ethics which are about not wanting to take too much and put back. Every time you take something, put back in kind or more for the future. So we have models in their ways of living as well. Okay, I'll stop now.
Okay, no, already very interesting conversation. But before we dive into the panel discussion, let us quickly also give Warren the chance to introduce himself, and then we'll jump right into.
Well, thank you, everybody. I'm so honored to be here with all of you and everybody who's joining us. I am joining you from Shumash Land, which is on the Pacific coast of California. I'm on a sailboat here and next to a wildfire that is burning out of control, just on the land, just upwind from us. So, kind of an interesting time to have this topic being discussed together. I, like Rosemary, I also have kind of cut my teeth in the work in development and humanitarian sector in post-war contexts. My first project was working in right as the war ended in Liberia in 2005, and bringing permaculture into that country, and it was a huge learning journey, and one of the learnings that came out of that is that the permaculture methodology had to adjust to be relevant in the different places that it lands, and especially in a post-war conflict area where a lot of conflict is still happening, and from that, I started working in different parts of, mostly in Africa, and brought permaculture to Kenya, and then on from there. And since 2014, I was asked to join a team as a technical lead for the USAID's Bureau of Humanitarian Affairs and all of their programming globally, to develop, to basically bring together permaculture, agroecology, agroforestry, the soil food web, the rainwater harvesting movements into a toolkit that could be programmed by the larger NGOs and even smaller community-based organizations in different humanitarian and development contexts. So since 2014, we've developed this process we call resilience design, which at the very core is the design science of permaculture. And we, under the BHA programming, we've brought it to different consortiums in over 17 countries around the world. And then about 2.5 years ago, with funding from Patagonia, and the founder of Patagonia, Yvonne Chenard, we developed a demonstration, research, and training center in a refugee camp in northern Uganda in partnership with a group called African Women Rising, which is a local organization run by women from the Acholi tribe, from South Sudanese, mostly the refugees in the refugee camp there. And we've been training people from all the United Nations, the International Office of Migration, to the World Food Program, the Danish Refugee Council. We just had some of their global team just do this 2-week training that we do there, where we're training trainers who then go back into their programs and use this resilience design project, the toolkit, to be able to bring permaculture in a relevant way. And we, in the discussions, we can talk more, but that's really where my time and energy is. I was just in Uganda last week. Next week, I'll be in Somalia, working with the UN and with FAO there on a very large project with displaced peoples in the Shabelle River region. So it's an honor to be here, and I'm really grateful for this discussion, because I think it's really timely and important right now as more and more people are being displaced globally. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you guys so much. I feel like I'm already learning from each of you, and I appreciate that. For everyone who's joined, we are going to start the discussion now. Please, if you have questions, go ahead and post them in the chat. We will do our best, and at the same time, we want to leave space for having deep conversations, even if we only get to 1 or 2 questions. So thank you all, and we're going to get started with, from your experience from each of you, which there's a lot here. What would you say makes a community vulnerable to current climate change conditions, and how are NGOs currently responding to support these communities, or how are they not? If Galawezh, would you like to get started on that, as you recently shared about the new opportunity there?
Sure. I think what makes a community vulnerable is basically displacement. And a community is already vulnerable when the government doesn't provide the necessary services anyway. And then when war comes on top of it, then it's double trouble. So, as you know, in Iraq, for decades, people have been suffering from displacement, from war, from mismanagement of resources. For me, the most dangerous one was displacement from villages to cities. That's because for Kurds and Arabs, actually, in the south, we're mostly agrarian society, and all of a sudden they were introduced to satellites and high-rise buildings. So the new generation have forgotten how to do agriculture, you know. So that added extra burden, you know, and the older generation, no one listens to the older generation anymore, you know, because the attention span has become so small that they don't want to listen to what we did in the past. So yeah, and then for decades now, I've been thinking that the aspiration of the people of the developing countries to be like the West, you know, is somehow, it's good and bad, but it's mostly bad because we're not learning from the experiences of the West, saying that what they have done is wrong, and we should be learning from the lessons of the West while we're developing. That I'm not seeing. How I'm not seeing it? In 2002, between 2002 and 2004, when I wanted to introduce the concept of permaculture in a village where UNHCR funded us to rehabilitate. The community needed a lot of education. I did bring a top consultant, and that is Jeff Lawton. Unfortunately, it didn't go well because the community was not willing to accept that, and B, the government was actually looking into modernizing our villages. So it was a little bit hard to sell, if you like. But yeah, so the communities in displacement are most vulnerable because they're not living in their places of origin. However, the international community comes in. The division of sectors that the UN, for example, has come up with, the cluster of WASH, the cluster of livelihood. It's not multidisciplinary. It's not integrated solutions. So while these IDPs and refugees come into a land, the first thing they do is giving them NFIs and food just to survive. But in my opinion, that from day one, we should allow these communities to practice agriculture and as part of their daily lives. We have a Kurdish saying. We say a goat makes its place comfortable even for a night. Yeah. And I think we should allow for that to happen with IDPs and refugees, and allow them to do community gardens, which Rosemary had done. I know, I'm aware of it, in the refugee camps of Duhok. So because that, not only they feel part and parcel of the culture and forget about displacement, but also for me, it's part of healing, because that's what I saw from permaculture. I saw people who suffer from mental illness and things and came and practiced and volunteers at permaculture sites, and they felt better. So I think that's a concept that the developing community should actually consider doing projects, permaculture projects, because it's holistic. It tackles WASH, it tackles livelihood, it tackles mental health. So yeah.
Rosemary, what are you thinking?
I'm thinking the same thing, but I'm also thinking slightly differently. I'm thinking vulnerability comes partly from geography. And I remember the deaths I saw in Vietnam when there was an unexpected cyclone and no one had any early warning. So the fishing boats were all out and the whole village was inundated, and there was a metre of rice across the rice fields in Vietnam. And the next morning we went down, they were lying all the bodies on the beaches. That's one form of a vulnerable community, and it's going to become more vulnerable. And I'd say now if people live on the coast, they need to move. That would be the best resilience and adaptation. Not think you've got time to put in littoral forests and mangroves, and we need to be doing it, but it's not going to do it. I think that's one thing. There's the geography of being in a mountain village on the Himalaya fringe and working with groups who said villages were being washed away because the ice, the 12,000 or something glaciers in the Himalayas, in those ice packs are melting so fast sometimes. And again, to some extent it's warning, to some extent they can't get up the slopes fast enough. So there's communication and there's geography, both of which are terribly important. And I think one of the things we should be doing extremely well is communication and knowledge. So, you know, what you're going to tell the Vietnamese is different what you're going to tell a small community in northwest India or somewhere else. It has different. Then we can look at a community like Afghanistan where people don't have, well, around the cities, they were pumping out bore water at the rate of 1 metre a year at one stage. We're looking at the failure of the snow melt, which was the beginning, which enabled people to grow their crops. So that snow melt can be a huge problem, as in India, if all those glaciers and Bangladesh floods because of the glaciers melting. It used to supply water, but now it flattens from there and it floods from the Bay of Bengal. So you've got multitudinal effects, multitudinous and multitudinal effects. You've got poor government. So if you look at an earthquake in Japan, probably a serious earthquake, and I was talking to someone in Taiwan the other day, they had one of 4.3, but some years ago in Romania, 60,000 people died because they weren't prepared and the buildings were not done. So I'm thinking people are vulnerable if they're not prepared. They're vulnerable geographically. They're vulnerable if they don't have good communications. They're three things. Then I could sort of talk about the details of those communities meeting their own needs so far as possible and having their own plans. You know, we lost 12 million hectares of forests a couple of years ago, and the people who died in the next 6 months from smoke inhalation. But the lives were not lost by the fires. But those fires, I went to a place in Greece shortly after the fires, and they weren't used to them, expecting them. And the people had all collected on the edge of the Mediterranean with their arms around the children. And they had died there on the edge of the Mediterranean because they had no plans, no use, you know. So the factors are all very, very different. But most of it, preparation, communication, and geography, and some geography, just move. But we can expect more floods, 150%. We can expect more fires, and they're two important things. And I understand, and Rina, you can tell me this, but I understand the Taliban accepts climate change as a real and true situation, which means what, and years ago, I went to a meeting in Afghanistan. They said, how can we get more water? I said, you won't get more water. No, how can we get more water? I said, you'll have to do more with less, but we need more. So you see, we went round that, but it takes quite a lot to do more with less. That's a different culture, possibly even. It's changing yourself culturally, your crops, your watering, your behaviours, your government approach. But I'd say to anyone, start looking at climate figures only for the last 30 years. Because if you look at 100 years, which might give you greater reliability, you won't get a really good reflection of the statistics we need to be looking at. And I know it's a short period and it will miss things, but it's likely to give you the greater reality. Well, that's just sort of some of the things. Whole nations are vulnerable. And whole communities are vulnerable. So you've got this huge range of vulnerabilities. It would be easier, perhaps, if we had a taxonomy of vulnerability in a way that we understand immediately. We're talking about those that are going to be flooded, those that are going to suffer from ocean rise, and those from cyclones, floods, and it seems increasingly sometimes earthquakes. So, then it probably is done. I think the UN's been doing it a bit, but we need to be tuned into it and take it into our permaculture knowledge so that we're relevant for the situations we're in. I did see a question come up there. Maybe we could answer it later, because we're going to talk about permaculture
We will.
and its ability to basically its preparation, and preparation saves lives.
Absolutely.
Can I jump in, Ella? Yeah. Maybe, I don't know, Warren, Rina, maybe one of you
Yeah.
want to address, like, not only what makes a community vulnerable, but maybe you can also explain from your
Yeah.
experience, how are usually NGOs and IGOs supporting, what is the standard method of supporting these vulnerable communities?
Yeah, if it's okay, I'm also good to yield it to you, Rina. I don't want to step in front there. If it's okay, so when I look at vulnerability, one of the things I see that directly corresponds to the level of vulnerability a community is experiencing is directly related to the amount of land degradation that they are immersed upon.
yeah.
They're sustaining ecology. And so, like what Rosemary was saying, like on the coastal communities, if the mangroves are not intact, the vulnerability of that coastal community is just elevated. And so globally, you can see that many of the most vulnerable communities have the worst levels of land degradation. And so what I see happens is that land degradation amplifies anything that's being experienced on a global level. So this kind of goes to Rua's question about what we can do or who was it that's Noura's question about how permaculture can help vulnerable communities is really to look at how we address land degradation on the local level. So one of the things that I see a lot of NGOs that are doing, and a lot of intergovernment organizations as well, as they're approaching their work with vulnerable communities by bringing in more land degradation. So movements like AGRA, which is basically the Green Revolution for Africa, which is the industrial agricultural model, there was a recent Tufts University study that showed that it's actually made communities more vulnerable when they've applied that. And there are several different communities around East Africa that are suing the Gates Foundation for actually making their communities more vulnerable based on this research that came out of Tufts University. So when you think about microclimate creation, is the goal in a lot of the work that we're doing with resilience design, which is to create conditions of restoration that help to buffer the extremes. So you're shifting a very degraded landscape, and even on the smallest scale, we're finding a microclimate could be created by one single person at their own space in a refugee camp can actually buffer some of the extreme events that are going on, and create conditions for better growth, for nutrition, and plants for income. So I feel like the design science of permaculture is really right at the core of how you actually address the land degradation issues. So you're working with stabilizing hydrology, building living soils, and working with biodiversity and protection of those systems. And that's when you start to see that a family can be eating cowpea greens from the garden in 10 days. In the worst conditions in the middle of the dry season in central Somalia. And so I'll stop there, but that's kind of what I have found that we can do as permaculturists is to come in with some of those skill sets around land restoration and how to do it in a very focused way with a design methodology. I just feel that that's such a central part of what we are able to bring across those sectors that you find that are in the big NGO world, that they've isolated all of these kind of their approaches into like what she was saying. You know, there's WASH, there's NRM, there's agriculture, there's protection, there's all these different sectors, and the design science of permaculture actually crosses through all of those by looking at how to work with the land directly. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm a little worried how long we're taking on the first question. I'll be brief.
It's totally.
To me, yeah, vulnerability, I agree with everything everyone has said, but I think about it in terms of when the population needs exceed the available resources, however that has happened. And that might be due to degradation, due to war, due to displacement, or due to overpopulation, due to a failure to recognize the limits that people live within, and then poor regulatory environment or exploitative regulatory environment. So Kabul is a perfect example where groundwater is not regulated. Every single house has its own bore. And 10 years ago, when I first arrived in Kabul, I remember that we had to drop our well from 80 meters to 100 meters because we literally were pumping mud. 2 months ago, we ran out of water for 3 weeks. Again, the well was dry, different part of the city. We had to drop to 150 meters. So in 10 years, we've dropped 50, 60, 70 meters. And they're predicting that Kabul will not be viable in the next 10 years. So that's 6 million people with no water. I wake up every morning to the water trucks yelling, "Oba Madani, Oba Madani," you know, selling mineral water that is so salty that it stings your eyes to wash your face. And I get rashes from the water that is available for people to drink. So yeah, there is a reason why the Taliban is being forced to acknowledge that this is a problem. They do want more water. We do need to find solutions for it. But, you know, we're talking a lot about NGOs and how they're programming this, that, and the other. It's the donors that have falsely separated everything. So you either get humanitarian funding or transitional development funding or development funding, and never the three shall mix. And there are absolute thick lines in between what you can implement under each of those categories. And it's really frustrating, like trying to do, we've put forward integrated programs. We've managed to convince a donor, we've got it through, and then the Taliban themselves say, well, which ministry does this sit under? It's going to take you 3 years to get this approved because you have to get approval from the water ministry and the land ministry and the agriculture ministry. And so we end up carving our projects up piecemeal just to get them approved. And yeah, from the humanitarian side, the way that NGOs are responding to a lack of resources is by providing resources. So we give cash. FAO in Afghanistan only provides wheat seed and fertilizer, nothing else. That's all they're fixated on. And I talk to them about biodiversity and all sorts of things, and they didn't want to talk to me. They're just looking at the wheat gap because that's their metric right now. So it's really frustrating, and we do need to find integrated ways of programming within the system, and advocate not just to donors but also to governments for approving such things.
Thank you. Yeah, very interesting. Maybe building on what all of you have said, then. But do you feel that whether it's the donors or the NGOs, IGOs, whoever, do you really feel that they have, okay, they're working with vulnerable communities, but do you feel they are also, are they aware of the impacts specific to climate change? And is this on their agenda, or is this something that is still not really maybe talked about, but maybe not really translated into actual programs? I'm not going to mention a name. Maybe you guys can decide, like, and raise a hand or speak as you like.
I can go ahead because my master's degree was on environmental mainstreaming and international development programs, and it was weak. The conclusion was that it was weak. So there are segregated projects that are inherently environmental, fine. But I think this environmental mainstreaming is new, and I think the UN acknowledges that these days, which is great. It's never too late to do something. So yeah, we are seeing it, but in Iraq, for example, there is lack of experts. There is lack of technical expertise. There are policies. The UNDP continues to support the government with NDC development and all of these things, but the people in power actually don't have that knowledge. So, Roa, probably you also know, you're from here. So, and I saw Dr. Dr. Noor from the College of Agriculture is in the participants, so she would know that as well. So we need a lot of expertise and education here. So there is that acknowledgement that we need to do something about climate change. I mean, we saw what's happening in south of Iraq, for example. There's migration happening because of the oil wells in the south, because the marshes are drying up, not only in Basra, but also far up, Nasiriyah and all of those areas. So I think, thankfully, the projects and the programs are going towards sustainability, and they don't call it, I don't know what they call it because of this funding issue. There's so much lack of funding. The projects are so limited, and I think if we just implement a permaculture project, it will really rehabilitate the land and bring communities back to their places. But yeah, so that's what I think.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to add on this?
I think we're also tied to the political agenda of the donor in many cases, and Afghanistan in particular as a non-recognized government. Donors aren't willing to invest. So I've actually had a case where I was given a extremely large amount of money for cash distributions, and we tried to make it cash for work because the Taliban wanted cash for work, the community wanted cash for work, we wanted cash for work. We could actually implement some good things with the money, and the donor said no. We don't want to invest in this country. We want to keep people alive. That's all we want to do. And so again, it depends on the stream of funding that you're going for. Yeah. So right now for Afghanistan, capacity building, infrastructure, development are all dirty words. We are not allowed to use them. We are limited to pure humanitarian until further notice. So that is problematic. But the value that I see is that permaculture really is a lot about interpersonal relationships. It's about an understanding of how the world works. It's about individual people having agency to do what they need to do in their own environment. We actually don't need that much money to do permaculture. And so I see it as something that can be mainstreamed quite easily through, we do a lot of training with cash, or a lot of training with WASH, or a lot of training. I don't see any reason why we can't do hygiene training, sanitation, hygiene training, DRR, which we do already, disaster risk reduction, and then add permaculture and just say, this is our package, this is what we do, and start rolling it out across all our programs until we find those champions and then bring them out to do more training. And I actually think it is there are easier ways of bringing it in without actually just having permaculture specific programs. I think we need to mainstream it across because it is going to be difficult to find donors that want to do just permaculture, especially in a humanitarian context or a really volatile environment. Like most of the environmental funding, especially climate change funding, is tied to the country's development goals and the targets that they've set, which requires the regulatory framework and a functional government that can sign up to that. And the Taliban are totally wanting to do that because they see this as their way to get recognized. They say, we have a climate change problem, so we can get recognized, and you can't take us away from the table because we're top 10. It's a total political game. They don't care about climate change. They want money. So if we take it away from that and say, yeah, that's fine, but let's bring it in, let's mainstream it. That doesn't cost much. So that's where I personally see the hope. I'll stop. And sorry if you can hear the cat meowing loudly in the back.
It's so interesting. I've got less experience than you with working with a lot of big NGOs. I mainly worked with smaller ones within the country. But where I've found it very difficult to bring 20 or so organizations together and say, look, women and governments and economy and marketing and design for cleaning water and shade could be put into one fabulous design for this camp or part of the camp. Often you wouldn't be easy to do it for 50,000 people, but the camp could be 5 or 6 groups, and they often fall into sections, and they could be absolutely transformed in no time. I haven't been able to bring them together, and I haven't known what would. But I know each one, Wash was saying, well, we know all about water, we've got nothing to learn, so we're doing it. And we'd be thinking, but there's, those filthy sewers running down there, and that water could be cleaned by a series of plants, and it could be directed to be, that was an issue for me, but I don't know how prevalent it is. And it seems to me, Warren, you get through this stuff and pull these groups together pretty well. Are you doing it on the ground or away a bit and then go to the sites?
Thank you, Ro. One of the things that we have found, and this addresses Anne Ziegler's question in the chat box about the colonial power structure and the white saviorism. And one of the things that we have seen, the way, so first off is a lot of cultures around the world. So it's not just in the most vulnerable places in the world, but just culturally, if there's land degradation that's going on, oftentimes there's not a cultural route to address that degradation. So they have cultural processes that are about tending to an intact environment. And so when we come in and we're invited into a community, so that's the first thing that is very important to me, is that we have to be invited. There has to be an invitation. And that when we're invited in, then the first process in this is this very in-depth community engagement process that has to do with listening to the story of place and what has actually been their story. And even if they're displaced from a different area, what is their story of how things have got to where they are? What's the story now? And then what is the story they want to write for their future? And often what we find is that what they want to write for their future is where we can support them. And often that has to do with shifting the land degradation into something productive. And so that then we look at culturally there, what is the wisdom in the community to do that, and where can we bring something that they're saying, we don't know how to get this tree going because every time we put this tree in the ground it doesn't work, but the hydrological part of that landscape has been destroyed, and so how do you restructure that? And so that's something we often bring to the table, but it's always guided by community wisdom, and that it's demonstration based. And that's the other piece that I think is really important, is that it is kind of wrapping into, like Rina talking about some of the difficulties with donors and with and how to shift government, is for for us, we've found we come together around demonstration sites. So we always talk about the three most important ways to bring in a different way of interacting with the landscape. The first one is demonstration. The second one, and just as important, is demonstration. And the third and most important is demonstration. And so once we land demonstration of this process of restoration and high production with very low cost, and that's what Rina was talking about, is that it doesn't take a lot of money to do this. So part of the community engagement process is actually resource identification, where they teach us about the landscape. Even refugees who have been displaced far from their home still know more about that landscape than we would ever know. And they lead us on this resource walk that helps us to identify every single thing we need to get a productive system at any scale. So we're working at the household level, the farm level, and even watershed restoration level, doing these demonstration sites that drive the donors to actually change how they're interacting with their own policies of how that money can be used. And that could be another question that we talk about later, but I'll stop there.
I think these are beautiful questions, guys. And Warren, like what you're talking about, the resource assets, like it's both physical assets and also knowledge assets. There's so much within these communities to draw upon, and just kind of pulling those together. I think this might kind of lead into a question that combining Nora and Eugene's question on scale and some of the challenges they seem to be facing as to how to make it accessible for small family, but then also when you're in a larger context in more crowded spaces or urban spaces, how have you seen permaculture kind of fill in those gaps where the humanitarian space isn't? What are your thoughts on that? And I'll also just who feels like they got a word to say, go for it.
Can I open there? Because permaculture starting in Australia was all about everyone having access to land. And in Vietnam, they said you can't do permaculture, you don't have land. And I pretty much accepted that. And we tried to do a project with disabled war victims who didn't have homes, but you couldn't do it because they were too busy looking for food and shelter for the day. Their resources were gatherers and collectors, and they couldn't learn, and it wasn't clear where they'd work. Then it was in Hong Kong, I realized these huge buildings, and they were starting to take some of the bottom floors that were formerly parking and turn them into a nursery, organic cafe, worm farms, second-hand shops, and reverse, and use certain areas. I saw a fish culture system as big as a small bread box. And what they were doing on window ledges and appropriate aspects of those buildings could be done. It went beyond balcony farming to extremely small scale farming. And it's really a way for looking in as well into how offices could become productive. They've got heating and light on all day. They've got things happening. Often they've got solar facilities. Those small scale things are absolutely available to us if we really wanted to look at them. And people ignore, if you're driving into a building, you've often got a sun-facing wall. You could just hang it in food. The sort of thing we were doing the refugee camps in Bangladesh, one plastic bottle, top cut off and hung on a wall, and then you'd have a whole wall with 1,000 bottles growing food for people and gardens. That is only food, but then you add the shade tree and the water cleansing, you're coming up with a permaculture integrate. Then you add a little marketing strategy and seed saving, which was important in COVID when the distribution broke down and people starved in the country. So, looking at how permaculture is this constant integration of approaches, it's not just the one. If we just think it's a vegetable garden for a family, so to answer the question, there's pretty much no space too small. You can grow mushrooms. You can For protein, you can have tiny little water systems, you can have tins, you can have vertical growing. I don't think there's anything too big. I'd like very much to look at every country and see how we could give it a forest boundary, and how we could green all the rivers and rehabilitate them and fill them with vegetation never to be cut, inalienable, and leave do the tops of mountains to slow water or make rivers run all year. It's possible to add that design from a continental stage right through to almost a tiny balcony. There's nothing too small or too big, but don't think just of food. Think of all the other things that are happening, the economic, the integration, the water use, the sunshine. You know, you've got a lot more than you actually see when you do those things. That's me.
So, guys, if you see Iraq, the development in Iraq, you had these huge houses in Baghdad, actually across all Iraq. So the size of the living area was much smaller than the size of the garden. A garden was a must. Now, you don't see gardens anymore. It's just rooms, more rooms for the kids and the family. So it's a reverse way of living. And I think one day people will wake up with a shock that, you know, I need to eat. I need some greenery. They complain about air pollution, which is horrible in Iraq. I mean, if you look at that site that gives the air quality index, it's always not suitable for living. But then again, there are some incentives in Iraq that says, okay, with a child born, you need to plant a tree, which is really nice, but do they do it? Not sure. With a new house being built, you need to plant a tree, which is also a very nice initiative, but is it being implemented? Not really. So what I'm trying to say is that it depends on people, really. So, for example, in Kirkuk, ages ago, with a friend of mine who's an agriculturalist as well. So we did some research about urban gardening. So there were these lands, abandoned lands along the Khasa River. It's called Khasa River, but there's no river because of drought. But however, so there are lands available. So people go and plant those lands to plant herbs and things. And so, but the problem is, the reason I want to do permaculture is because of the peace building and social cohesion part of it, you know? So the people, yes, they said, okay, this plot of land, which belongs to the government, they go and plant it with herbs and things for themselves. But can the neighbor go and do the same? No, it's going to create social tension. But with education, with permaculture, because it's so holistic, it can tackle that. So I think this probably answers Dr. Noor's question about small-scale agriculture or permaculture in the cities. I think there are plenty of parks that are abandoned, and the government is not greening it at all. So I think there's a chance for that to implement it. And I disagree with my colleagues here, because in Iraq, I feel that we need some funding to do anything, because the volunteers who want to help, they need transport money, they need food, they need water. So you really can't do it without money, you know. It's and permaculture teachings these days are also becoming expensive. You know, if you bring a consultant, they need money as well. So accommodation, flight, and everything. So, yeah.
Okay, but maybe building on what you said, like, okay, maybe money is not always available, resources are not always available. Maybe building on all of your experience, Warren, Rosemary, Rina, Galawezh, have you seen examples of very low scale like projects where it's really like you need minimal resources just to like start the seed of a maybe an urban permagarden space, something like that? Can you maybe provide an example?
I'll jump in. I think we just lost Ro, but I just to address your the money issue, is it's not that projects don't, the programming definitely needs money, but the the people who are the participants in this and the on the ground don't need money to replicate it. And I think that's really an important distinction, is that you get more uptake in a community when someone can see what's going on at a neighbor's and that it can be replicated. And so oftentimes, and I appreciate you brought up the conflict issue as well, because so much of this work is about what I call environmental peace building. And it is around working with communities, not just individuals. And so I think that has to be a programming imperative, is that like in northern Uganda, in Palabek refugee camp, we're approaching each block within that refugee camp. We're doing a whole block approach. So when we go in, we work with all the households in one particular area. So we're not just working with a few of the different households and they get all this resources and then it creates this tension in the community. But you're very right that we should be using so much of the money that is coming through the humanitarian development industry to build the programming around different scales of this application. And so I wanted to address that, and I'll hand it back over to other comments. So
can I also agree? Yes, it costs money, but what I'm saying is the amount of money that we dump in cash programming in humanitarian aid is orders of magnitude higher than what is required to do a good permaculture intervention. So that's why I'm saying, if you've got, for example, a 10 million euro program, you could easily mainstream permaculture with 3 people's salaries. And then you're dumping the money, you're ticking the box, everybody's happy, but you've actually, those people are training multiple topics and you're adding to that, and you're doing things on ground and potentially layering projects as well. So yeah, it's not no money, but just, I guess, at the scale that I call it guilt money that we're receiving. And I think we could do a lot more with it. And yeah, you can tick the box, but we can also go a lot further and optimize positions that are already being paid for, systems that are already set up in terms of logistics and procurement and transport, and all of that is there for other programs that can then be shared. That was the point I was trying to make. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Then maybe a very direct question: why is that not happening?
Humanitarian aid organizations don't generally recruit permaculture people. It's a different category. That's a development thing, not an aid thing. So Afghanistan right now used to have a development stream, and WHH is a development NGO. And in order to stay, we've pivoted to humanitarian, and now we're trying to push as fast as we can. And I mean, I was at the Ministry of Agriculture 6 months ago, and they said, you are the first NGO that's come to talk to us. We've been in power for 3 years and you're the first to show up. So WFP's been there, FAO's been there, because no comment, but we show up as the first, saying we're ready to pivot. We need to be looking at seeds. We need to be looking at soil. And they said, thank you. Where's the money? And I'm like, can't give you any, but I can design you a demonstration farm for you. So I'll let you know if I get to be the first person to design a Taliban demonstration farm. But yeah, this siloing of cash and siloing of, if you're doing humanitarian, then you're only allowed to do agriculture under the stream of food security and nutrition, which means only these activities are viable. And there aren't enough people that I've been able to find to get the momentum happening, which is why I stepped down and have moved into this job to do it full time, to try and find the like-minded people and try and get a momentum, because everyone is really, really busy fighting the government about women, fighting the government about education, trying to get some skerrick of a health system in place. FAO's dumping wheat seed, everyone thinks it's fine, they're good to go. And other conversations beyond that just aren't happening. So I'm trying to start that.
Yeah. If I look at a different scale, I've always thought, can I embed the knowledge locally somehow? So I have, perhaps in Afghanistan, we were teaching the local peace volunteers when we went to Cambodia, we taught a women's affairs department in one province. Then they did a teaching, and then they went to other provinces and taught. And it was really interesting because each of those women who learnt in the first one had to set up, as a provincial woman in the women's affairs, had to set up their own permaculture system. Within a short time, they were thriving. They were selling at the bus stations and grafting trees and doing interesting things. And they could see, the country was ground zero, but they took it and they did it within their salaries and their work budget. In Uganda, is it Rakai or is that in Ethiopia? Anyway, in Uganda, we found that the local Department of Agriculture sent their officers along, and those people said, we've been told to teach sustainability, but we don't know what it is or how to do it. Years later, I wrote back to that head of department, said, what difference did he make? Oh, he said, we haven't deviated much at all. All our officers are still using permaculture through our provincial Department of Agriculture. Now, for me, that's the most desirable thing we can do, is leave it behind with those groups. So even in the camps, if we can say to people as well, you need resources, grow some seed and sell it locally. Do some cuttings from citrus and learn how to propagate those, and do it locally, because you might be here for a long time. So long as we can embed it in the country, and if possible in rural areas, it worked. Now, it can also be taken apart, because after we left Vietnam and it had been widely spread, then the Chinese, could easily have been the Americans, the Germans or the Australians, arrived and gave out free fertilizer, as they do in Malawi, I think. Every Monday you can go and pick up your free packets of fertilizer from someone sending it in. Now they're coming back to permaculture. So there's been this huge pollution of rivers, change of systems, and now they want it all back again to what they had. So we can't ever assure anything, but I think to embed our knowledge locally with people on salaries is the best thing we can do. Mm. Yeah. That's my feeling anyway, because you never know. You won't go back. You don't know the money will arrive. You don't know how it's used, but the knowledge and a few examples. Really, those programs cost less than $10,000, including my fare, and I didn't take a salary, and visa and everything. And that also left people with $2,000 do a permaculture project to report to us over the next 5 years. They did amazing things. We didn't ask for accountability or an outcome. And they wrote back and they've made films, and in Malaysia they're teaching all the different ethnic groups at the children's schools, and they're writing lessons, and but usually one person grabs the dream and runs with it. But if they do, you can sit back. That person will run very fast and spread it everywhere they're going. Mm-hmm. That's me.
Can I maybe one question specifically for Warren and Rosemary, but please, the others, please also feel free to jump in. Since you've been working on and with permaculture-related projects for more than 20, 30 years, have you seen a change nowadays specifically with regard to climate change impacts? And have you seen that, or have you experienced that you needed to adjust your methods, or do you feel it still works the same? Or do you feel like the unpredictability of weather, of climate and so on has created another layer of difficulty?
Big question. I think just briefly, yes, I've seen some changes, and some of them negative, with the arrival of massive amounts of chemicals. 60,000 new ones are released on the market every year, and that's a huge problem. But I've also seen a return to what they were doing and how it worked. Refugee camps have been sadder because the INGOs and NGOs are pulling out at the moment in some places, as Kayla knows and I know, and it's tragic. I get very upset about that. So it is fixed. You can never assure it. You can only offer what is really best practice and hope it sticks. The way today young children go back to their grandparents and say, you had a garden, didn't you? Show me how to do it. and how they're going back to walking to school instead of being driven, and how, you know, all those things. There's a sort of a cycle in it, but the knowledge has to be in there somewhere. Warren, what about you?
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that, Ro. I mean, I've seen a lot of changes over time, and I think for myself, one of the things that has shifted in the approach is addressing a lot of the kind of the narrative that's given to us by the donors and the different programs, and how they have there's like a conventional way of approaching development and humanitarian different programming. And so one of the things that I have, one big question that a lot of governments ask, as well as USAID, DANITA, GIZ, is this scalable? And so one of the changes that we've really brought to this is this understanding of working in, well, I call it working in fractals. So if you have one permagarden, which is at a household that's, you know, 30 meter by 30 meters in a refugee settlement, and you have 130 by 30, that one small area, it doesn't seem to have a huge impact. But if you have that program now addressing 3,000 households in that area, you actually have a whole NRM project, you have a disaster risk reduction project, you have a WASH project, you have an agriculture project. And what we're finding is that how we verbalize what we're doing and how to think it through differently for the donor and the programs to actually step back and go, okay, wait a minute, this can be scalable, but it also can have this impact across these different sectors, has been one of the biggest things that I've seen that has changed how it's being received by some of these larger NGOs. The other thing that I think is really important change is how the big NGOs work with the CBOs, the community-based organizations that are usually made up of the people of those communities. And what I've seen is that colonization approach, where they come in and they give a very small amount of their project money to have a lot of the bulk of their on-the-ground work happen with these community-based organizations. And what we've been trying to do is to change that narrative so that the larger organization is being driven by the CBOs. They're being driven by the knowledge that comes from the community organizations that have been working there, that are usually made up of those communities. So for example, African Women Rising in northern Uganda, they're one of the largest employers in northern Uganda, and they're a small organization run by Acholi women and run by South Sudanese women who are mostly in the refugee camps that are there. And they are our most critical partner in this, driving an understanding for WFP to change their programming. And so they're now being hired by Danish Refugee Council, WFP, to be technical leads on these larger projects. And I feel that change is causing a monumental shift in how some of this programming is landing on the ground.
Yeah.
That's really beautiful, guys. It's good to see that people are open to change. I feel like that's a big tug of war in the NGO sector, and to see that it's happening and there's positive results from that is really encouraging. We have 10 minutes left, so I want to honor everyone's time. I'd love to kind of open the floor to what are pieces you feel we haven't talked about that need to be addressed, whether challenges or stories of hope or stories of change in the way that you started doing things and now you're doing them differently. I feel like we touched on these, but if there's a piece of that you're like, oh wait, we need to share this story, let's open the floor for that space.
Very quickly, Kayla. So, for me in Iraq, the people in power, let's say, be it in government or head of NGOs, head of donors, they have limited knowledge about permaculture. Now, that leads me to the other issue, and that is the term permaculture. When you want to introduce the concept, they go and check it out, and it actually feels like a movement. And the status quo doesn't like movement, you know. They say, what is this? This is like the alternative hippie, you know. it's threatening. So they go ahead, they believe in the concept, but they don't like that movement. So they come up with terms like agroecology, sustainable agriculture. You know, they just don't want to say permaculture. I mean, the concept is amazing, it's holistic, it's great, but I feel it's threatening to the donors, to the people who don't understand it, to buy into it, you know? I don't know if it's only me or others have experienced this.
I'm not sure. I've heard that for years. And then I've found that actually permaculture was getting so strongly embedded. And as David Suzuki said, it's probably the biggest people's movement across the world. So it is a movement, but it's a movement of an applied science. And people have said to me, change the name. And I think it's too late. I don't think we can change the name. And I don't think it would honor the founder, because it's a brilliant, brilliant study of integrating. And also we're not doing enough on the social side of the community organizations, the ethical finance, you know, the access to land that is a critical part of permaculture and comes into the third ethic. And so I think it's people who don't know anything about it, and they're seizing on one thing. So you might think a forester cuts down trees, right? Or you might think a fisherman catches fish. Often their world is bigger and wider than that. And similarly, I think permaculturists, because it's a systems approach, it's integrated approach, it's hard to reduce it to a single definition. But an applied science is part of my definition most of the time, and applying ecological design to human systems. So that's whether it's a city or a rural area, makes sense. Well, you've got landscape architecture, you know, they're doing nice, good-looking buildings and places. You've got architecture, and that's fine. Where is your landscape architecture, so to speak, or your design science for human settlements and living and food supplies? That's the genius of permaculture. And I see it takes words, and it's a bit difficult, but it's worth persevering with. Once people have done a course, there's no problem. Absolutely there. You know, they're saying, why didn't we know this before? And someone should have told us, or I've had a look at my village, there's so much we should be doing and it's not fair. And you get this indignation that they haven't been given the knowledge. But until then, all the prejudice of someone who doesn't know is being, but it's often not as much as you think. It may be someone who's a little bit loud or vociferous, but it may not be that many people at all. Because actually, Jeff Mollison said it's revolution designed as gardening. It actually is. Takes trucks off the road, breaks the power of seed companies, produces local food, gets rid of big super. You know, if you did it, you would have a really spread economy of and design that would, you know, transform the world. So it is revolution as a vegetable garden in its implications. So in a way, I don't mind them saying that. But in another way, I think it's so limited. It's people talking about what they don't know usually.
Maybe Warren can help us, integrate that permaculture term into their language and system, and easier for us NGOs to approach.
It's such an interesting thing, because it's when I first started with USAID in 2014, we did a survey of their literature and found that there was only 2 references to permaculture, and I think now there's close to 8,000 references. So but it's very interesting because for us, we had to embed permaculture into a different framework. And so what we did is, and let me explain why, is that we took permaculture as the design science that led agroecological approaches, agroforestry approaches, and basically said at the root of that, we use the design science of permaculture to apply that. So we were, in essence, by languaging in it that way and calling it resilience design, we were bringing in other movements that were being recognized by the UN, by other donors that were saying, okay, we'll work with agroecology, but not permaculture. But we're saying like at the core of agroecology, a well-established implementation of that would use permaculture to do that good design. And so, and then as Ro was saying, is that there's so much more around that. It's the justice pieces, it's the ethical pieces that you don't find in these other movements. So what we found worked really well, that idea of resilience design. And now what's really exciting, and this is my last little story here that you said about a story, is that we are now having donors like USA, Danita, GIZ, they're calling out for resilience design in some of their proposals. And I think for me, that's like, we've got our foot in the door now with a lot of these larger NGOs. And now it's really looking and saying, okay, how do we work with these different players who have been programmed for the Green Revolution style agricultural approach and really poor non-conscious design of human settlement, and how do we bring our seat at the table in a way to start to make the changes? And for me, I'm so hopeful, and we're seeing at such a large scale this is working, and entire countries are starting to embed some of this in their ideologies. So I'm super excited about it, and I appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about it.
Thank you, guys. Rina, would you like to add some thoughts to this?
No, thank you. Sorry, I'm just listening to the answers.
No, you're so good. Oh, beautiful. Well, I am incredibly grateful that all of you have joined us today. I think there's a lot of questions that we didn't have the chance to get to. So if people are still like hanging on threads with their questions, feel free to email us. I can add our email into the chat, and we will try to have those conversations with you. But again, Rosemary, Warren, Rina, Galawezh, I'm so grateful that you've joined us today from morning to evening. I hope that you have a good day, good afternoon, and good evening. And thank you everyone for joining. And I think we're gonna go ahead and end this call, but thanks everybody. And hopefully we'll get to talk again soon. Okay.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having. Thanks for the invitation. It was lovely to be here with this group. It's wonderful. And you're all doing marvelous things. It's just courage and morale to get on and keep doing it, isn't it? Bigger and more.